Title of the talk, turkey tail healing properties and cultivation techniques. I wanted to focus on turkey tail today. It's a favorite of mine. So my name is Melissa Pernell. I'm an herbalist down at Meadow Sweet Herbs, where I've worked for the past 6 years. Before that, I earned a Bachelor's of Science from the University of California, Davis in the Department of Evolution, Ecology, and Biodiversity. While I was an undergrad, I worked in several plant pathology labs, working on research projects involving mycorrhizal fungi. I did another research project that was published involving entomopathogenic fungi, which infect and kill insects, used as a biological control agent in lieu of pesticides. And then I also worked in a plant pathology lab working with farmers who were dealing with pathology. Hi, what's your name?
I'm Sarah.
Hey Sarah, welcome. You don't happen to know David Lay, do you? No? Okay. Just so you know, there's tea back there, hot water, and the back room is in that back corner. Thank you. Okay. After my undergraduate degree, I moved to Montana and did a Master's of Science in the Forestry Department, where I studied the fungal insect symbiosis of the mountain pine beetle. While I was doing my master's thesis, my health started to decline because of the stress, and that was when I became involved in herbalism because I needed to find a way to bring back my vitality, and I was not getting any answers from Western medicine. And yeah, that's what brought me to Meadow Sweet Herbs and mushroom medicine. So there's a lot of medicinal mushrooms. I decided to focus on turkey tail today for a couple of reasons. First of all, the medicinal properties are very well established, not only scientifically, but also through the folk record. It's been used for thousands of years by human beings, and animals, actually. And another reason it's a really great mushroom to focus on is that it's really easy to cultivate without a sterile lab. When I was working in labs, we had to use a lot of energy-intensive processes to keep everything sterile, and I just didn't find that to be very practical. So I looked into other ways of cultivating mushrooms without having to use an autoclave and a laminar flow hood. And I think the benefit of focusing on turkey tail is also that in non-sterile conditions, it thrives because it's such a good competitor. You'll often find it in the wild coexisting on logs with other mushrooms. It tends to not only coexist, but outcompete weed species like bacteria. And yeah, it's just a really vigorous fungus. And if you wanted to cultivate it on your own, it's a great one to start with. So is everybody familiar with Paul Stamets? Y'all know who he is? You've probably all seen this TED Talk?
No.
All right, let's watch it. We're just going to play a few minutes from it, where he talks about turkey tail.
So another mushroom empowers the immune system, and this is turkey tails. And turkey tail mushrooms have also been used for more than 1,000 years. NIH funded our group with a $2.1 million breast cancer clinical study, which has been recently completed. Now, this breast cancer clinical study was dealing with a non-ER, non-estrogen responsive breast cancer patients, ladies. And the study has come back with some remarkable results. And when patients have radiation therapy or chemotherapy, their immune system is oftentimes impaired, so natural killer cells are decreased. Taking these mushrooms as an adjunct therapy, not as a substitution, but to support the immune system, the natural killer cells increase on a dose-dependent basis. The red bar is no treatment with 3 grams and 6 grams per day. And then post-radiation, the immune system depressed, and then on a dose-dependent basis, the natural killers enhance over a period of 4 weeks. So this raises base immunity function, which I think is critically important. Now, this hit home to me very personally in June 2009, when my 84-year-old mother called me up and said, "Paul, I have something very serious to talk to you about, but you're always so busy." It's a terrible thing to hear from a mom. I said, "Mom, what's wrong?" And she's a very happy, genuine person. She goes, "I'm worried." And my mother's deeply religious, had not seen a doctor since 1968. She said, my right breast is 5 times the size of my left. I have 6 swollen lymph glands the size of walnuts. And her voice started shaking, and I'm not ashamed to admit that I started crying. Why didn't you tell me sooner? We spent a large part of June at the Swedish Breast Cancer Clinic in Seattle. The oncologist examined her, and upon the second examination, she had a 5.5 centimeter diameter tumor. It metastasized, it went to her sternum, it went to her liver. She had stage 4 breast cancer. The doctor gave her less than 3 months to live. They stated it was the second worst case of breast cancer she has seen as a doctor in 20 years of practice. We had the Circle family meeting. Many of you have gone through this. My mom announced that she bought a pine casket, the cheapest one that she could find, because she was going to heaven. But then the doctor said, you know, you're too old to have radiation therapy, you can't have your breast removed. But there's an interesting study on turkey tail mushrooms at Bristol Medical School. You might want to try taking those. And that's my mother goes, well, my son's supplying those. So she was put on Taxol and Herceptin, wonderful drugs. And then she started taking 8 turkey tail capsules a day, 4 in the morning and 4 in the evening. And that was in June of 2009. And today, my mother has no detectable tumors. And I'd like to bring that one back.
I do want to clarify that turkey tail did not cure her breast cancer. It did help her fare better when she was going through chemotherapy. She did eventually die this year, but it did give her 8 more years of life and increased her vitality during that time. So the common name of this mushroom is turkey tail. The scientific name was once Coriolis versicolor. It's now known as Trametes versicolor. In Chinese, it's known as yunzi, which means the rain cloud mushroom. In Japanese, it is known as karotaki, which means mushroom by the riverbanks. In Dutch, it is known as elfenbamji, I don't know how to pronounce that, which means fairy bench. And in German, it is called Schmetterling Tramete, which means the butterfly tramete. So it's found in a lot of places around the world. It's been known by a lot of cultures for a long time. This is a quote from this book that I brought in. Perhaps the most well-studied of all polypore mushrooms, yunzi has long been viewed as an ally to human health. Easy to identify in the wild, this zonate, multicolored mushroom is beautiful to behold and once formed, resist rot. It's a classic bracket fungus, and it is consists of closely concentric zones of fan-like shelves, often forming rosettes of overlapping fruiting bodies with a slightly hairy surface, usually with a wavy outer margin.
What is the bracket? Yeah, a bracket fungus compared
That's-
to, I guess, another fungus?
So, a lot of mushrooms that we're familiar with have like this is the stipe, and then this is the cap.
Mhm.
So that's like a caustic fungus, and then a bracket fungus, like it's coming out of a piece of wood right here, and it's like attached right here.
Smaller
this-
attachment.
Is
Yeah.
it the same as a shelf fungus? Or?
Yep, exactly. So you'll probably notice that all the pictures that I've shown, turkey tail looks different in every single picture. So the colors can vary widely, grays, browns, blues, greens, reds, white zones. The way that you can identify it though is that the undersurface will always have a flat, creamy or whitish surface. Like you can see here. There's other mushrooms that look a lot like this, but they'll have tooth-like pores, or it'll be like a kind of spongy surface, but turkey tail is very flat and will always be this whitish, creamish color. Also, on the top, there'll be like these alternating zones of like furriness, non-furriness, going back and forth. And you wouldn't see that in any of the lookalikes. And there are quite a few lookalikes. Some of them are more, some of the lookalikes are kind of thicker, like that, but turkey tail is always very flat.
Okay, we're always cautioned in the wild to know our mushrooms because they're poisonous somewhere.
Yeah.
Are there any turkey lookalikes that are poisonous?
I don't know if there are any that are poisonous. No, I'm not sure about that. Look that up and get back to you. Maybe during the break, I'll be able to look up in this book. It usually talks about lookalikes and whether any of them are poisonous. Generally, the shelf mushrooms are not poisonous.
Okay.
And all of them are beneficial or necessarily good for you, but I don't know of any that are a shelf-like formation that are going to kill you.
Okay.
Although Jeff, one time we were out hiking and he found it's a red belt, and he decided to pop it in his mouth and see what happened, and his ears started ringing immediately.
That was a shelf mushroom?
It was a shelf mushroom, red belt. They're really, really common.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they're used as like, they give you a lot of energy, but it obviously didn't agree with him.
But nothing else happened? That was
I don't think so. Did you have any other, did you feel like energized at all?
It was weird.
Yeah, he's a little unsafe sometimes. So the stem could be absent or present, but it's always going to be central, and it's always going to be very short if it is there. So you can see on this one that I brought in, there's no stem on these ones, but the ones coming out over here have a stem. They're like a very, very short stem.
Those are immature.
Immature? No, that's the fruiting body. Yeah, that's the reproductive stage. So it's fully colonized this log, and then once it's gotten all the materials that it wants to get, it'll make a fruiting body to spread itself. And find new food.
But is that the bigger part of it then? I mean, those look really big compared to what you used to call it.
It can vary in size dramatically.
Okay.
Yeah. I think the size of the mushroom will depend on the way that it's grown. These ones, I don't know that they necessarily got as much moisture as they wanted. I noticed I had another culture that was growing in the ground like this, and the fruiting bodies that are close to the ground, and there was also a sprinkler hitting it straight on, and that was where I got the biggest fruiting bodies from. And this one, it had growing like that for a while, and then I gave up on it, pulled it out and had it laying on the ground. I was gonna get rid of it. And after it started raining, it started to fruit, but it wasn't getting that direct watering the way the other one was. So it seems like the fruiting was not as plentiful. Also, the size of the log will affect the size of the fruiting bodies. But yeah, it can vary widely. Yeah. It's found in every single state in the US. It hasn't been reported in Nevada. That doesn't mean it's not there. Maybe there just aren't people interested in looking for it there. It's everywhere around the globe, all sorts of different climates, boreal, temperate, subtropical, tropical regions. It's one of the few mushrooms that is so adaptive. Most mushrooms will specialize in a certain habitat, but this one is just so amazing and can adapt to all sorts of different conditions. So I'm going to pass around some fruiting bodies that I collected from my garden this morning. Go ahead and take one and chew on it. It tastes pretty good. It's tough, like leather, so you're not going to be able to just chew it up and swallow it. I would just like chew on it and keep it in your mouth, letting like the juices kind of simmer. Traditionally, people will boil the fruiting bodies in a tea or a soup. And that's because the medicinal compounds found within the mushroom are water soluble. So it's gonna come out readily in soup or tea. It does have some antimicrobial properties. So if you do make a soup or a stock with it, it's gonna make that soup or stock last longer. It's gonna resist spoiling. So I like to simmer it for several hours with my bone broth and then just make my soups from it. And yeah, it tastes really good. It's also available in a powder form. If you're not into waiting 20 minutes to an hour for medicine, you can just get some of the powder, stir it in some warm water, and drink it. We have that downstairs at Meadow Sweet. And then some people just chew it, like you guys are doing right now. And I think you can all agree it tastes pretty good. It's one of the better tasting mushrooms out there. Yeah.
Can I go back a second?
Oh, sure. You guys have any questions about how to prepare it?
Something the size of that would be kind of a dose, or you need something to do.
I think that's about like a twice a day dose. Like
This is a twice a day, so you cut it in half?
I would take that much twice a day, depending
Oh,
on,
okay.
we'll get into that better, but like depending on whether or not you're trying to stay healthy or fight a condition, I would take more. It helps your immune system on a dose-dependent basis. So the more you take, the more it's going to help your immune system. So if your immune system needs a lot of help,
Yeah.
you'd want to take more. But yeah, I just take the minimal dose because I'm in pretty good shape right now. Any other questions? Is everybody familiar with flower essences? Okay, you guys all feel positively about it? It's not going to be too woo-woo if I talk about it? I thought this would be an open crowd. So we're going to take a little bit of a detour into the woo-woo. We'll get back to the science. I promise there's plenty of peer-reviewed studies backing up turkey tail. But for some people, flower essences are really beneficial. It's something that helps the mind to work in symbols. And it's like a way, a lot of people would say that flower essences are a placebo. But I see placebo as the method of harnessing our body's ability to mind over matter heal itself. So the turkey tail flower essence supports necessary demarcation against foreign influences and prevents seizure of personality. It is an anti-bullying essence. It brings you face to face with love and nurturing in all parts of yourself. All parts of you belong. For the eternal warrior, for those who need to ground their energies in the physical world. Turkey tail essence works through the energy circuits that influence the chemical structures holding the imprint of childhood abuse or trauma at a cellular level. Use it when you are ready to break down and release the patterns and memories of childhood abuse or trauma. Holding these energies can lead to physical symptoms such as fibromyalgia or autoimmune disorders, or emotional symptoms such as fear, powerlessness, or dissociation. And I think it's very interesting that these emotional components tend to be found to affect people's ability to resist the development of cancer and autoimmune disorders. There is an emotional component to disease. And fortifying ourselves emotionally as well as physically can have a profound impact on healing. It's been used traditionally by the Dakota to make their soups last longer, preventing spoilage. In traditional Chinese medicine, it's said to dispel wind and damp, which are a wide variety of conditions, but the most common ones are conditions affecting the lungs. It stops coughs, resolves suppurations, which are festering pustules, and promotes the growth of muscles when they have been degenerated. In traditional Chinese medicine, it's used for general immune weaknesses and tumors. It's energetically said to be sweet and slightly warming. You guys all kind of got that from chewing on it. It enters the heart and the spleen meridians. It's used for infections, inflammations of the upper respiratory and urinary and digestive systems. It increases energy and stamina, and it's often used for patients suffering from hepatitis as well. And I thought that was pretty interesting because I wasn't able to find any research to back it up, but the fungi perfecti host defense reps we're talking about preliminary studies showing that it supports both phase 1 and 2 detoxification of the liver, which is pretty cool because that's another component of health. So how does it work? We have a lot of science behind it. It is rich in compounds called long-chain polysaccharides. Polysaccharides are chains of sugars. So another polysaccharide that you guys are familiar with would be starch or cellulose. Starch and cellulose are more found in plants, but these long-chain polysaccharides called beta-glucans are they're also found in cereal crops. They're made by yeast, fungi, bacteria. But the way that the beta-glucan long-chain polysaccharides are branched will differ depending on the organism making them. So the fungi are branched at the 1 in 6 connection points. So they look very different than beta-glucan long-chain polysaccharides found in other organisms. These long-chain polysaccharides are unique in mushrooms because they're attached to proteins, and we don't see that in long-chain polysaccharides from other sources. So these long-chain polysaccharides attached to proteins are used by the body to make glycoproteins. And this is a glycoprotein right here. So this is the cell, this is the cell wall, or the lipophosphate bilayer. And so the protein portion will be submerged in the cell wall, and the sugar portion, the glyco portion, is extending out of the cell, and that extension is an identifier. It's like a luggage tag for your immune system. So it's how your body identifies toxins, viruses, bacteria, and also helpful immune cells. So these glycoproteins are just not very plentiful in a Western diet. But we need them. We need them so desperately to direct the flow of detoxification and the immune system. So when we eat mushrooms, we're getting them nutritionally. It's not acting as a drug in our body, it's acting as a constituent, a component that our body uses to build itself, to build its immune system. It's how we recognize ourselves from foreign invaders. So turkey tail has been studied in a couple of different ways. It's been studied as just a whole mushroom, like I passed around, and the studies on that show that it prevents the proliferation of tumor cells, it strengthens the immune system, especially during standard cancer treatments, where chemotherapy and radiation will lower the immune system. When people are using turkey tail, their immune system is brought back up and they're less likely to get secondary infections while they're going through chemotherapy and radiation. It's rich in prebiotic polysaccharides, so if you were to take a probiotic and you don't have any long-chain polysaccharides in your gut, the probiotics are not going to last. But if you have lots of prebiotics, which are the material that the probiotics feed off of, the probiotics are going to last longer in your gut, and you're going to have a better effect on your immune system from having those probiotics last longer. It's antioxidant, it's antiviral, it's antibacterial, and I kind of thought that's interesting. It's antibacterial, but it also supports probiotic gut bacteria, so it must be antibacterial selectively, not against all bacteria, but maybe just the ones that don't agree with us. There's also a lot of studies showing the effects of PSK, which is a concentrated form of turkey tail.
Can you explain the difference between, I start getting confused with mushrooms and bacteria. Sometimes I think a mushroom is a bacterium, just in a different form.
They're both microbes. They're both tiny at the cellular level, but metabolically they're very, very different. So bacteria tend to be, they're more on the chain closer to plants, and fungi are on the tree of life closer to human beings. So, and structurally they're very different too. So bacteria will always be one-celled. Fungus can go back and forth from being multicellular to being single cellular.
Okay.
depending on temperature. What other differences? I think that bacteria can have a couple of different ways of functioning. They can either be anaerobic or aerobic, meaning they'll live on oxygen or live on another source.
Mhm.
Fungi are always gonna be aerobic, they're always gonna need to breathe oxygen.
Okay.
Did that clarify? That's good. Any other questions? Okay. So PSK is a polysaccharide extract of turkey tail. It's a very, very concentrated form of turkey tail. It's commercially known as Crestin, and it's used in Japan as an anti-cancer drug. It's very, very popular in Asia, used extensively, and all Japanese healthcare plans cover its use, its cost. So PSK studies are pretty plentiful, even more plentiful than the turkey tail by itself. It's been shown to reduce cervical cancer lesions. It improves the integrity of blood vessels. It normalizes spleen function. It prolongs the use of antibodies, and it's an antibiotic synergist. So if you needed to use an antibiotic, if you were to use turkey tail along with it, your antibiotic is gonna work better and work for longer. It's a chemotherapy and radiation synergist, meaning that it makes those drugs and treatments work better, and it also helps you feel more vital when you're using those treatments. It prevents the metastasis of tumor cells. That means it prevents them from spreading throughout your body. It suppresses the growth of tumors. It actually inhibits the HIV virus. And it scavenges for free radicals, which are compounds that cause DNA damage, which leads to cancer.
I must have been somewhere else when you mentioned PSK. That's a derivative of turkey tail?
Yep, it's a concentrated form of the
It's not
polysaccharides.
synthesized? It's just
No, it's
concentrated.
not, it's concentrated. Yeah, they'll grow the turkey tail and then process it so that it's a more concentrated form
Oh,
of the components that have the immune effects.
And it is something like Crestin, is that available here?
I don't think so.
No.
I'm not sure about that. I know they might,
Online? Online?
I haven't looked into it. I do know that my aunt had lung cancer and she was using immunotherapy that was derived from mushrooms, but I don't think it was called Crestin. So I'm not sure. I should write down all your questions and get back to you.
Yeah, I just wondered if we could access that.
What was the other question you had?
Crestin available
Oh, about,
Oh, the poisonous lookalikes. Okay.
yeah,
All right.
where we go up in the woods.
Yeah. Okay. So, dosage, you were asking about dosage earlier. If you're just maintaining your health, you don't have any major health problems, you just don't want to get a cold this year, you can use about 3 grams per day, and that equates to a half a teaspoon of the powder, or 2 capsules twice a day. So half a teaspoon twice a day, or 2 capsules twice a day. For people that have serious conditions, you would double that dose, using a full teaspoon of the powder, or 4 capsules taken twice a day. And the 6 grams per day is the dosage that has been used in clinical peer-reviewed studies.
Let's do that for a second.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Any other questions? So we kind of already went over the traditional methods of consumption. People will put it in soups or teas, decocting it for 20 minutes to several hours. A decoction is where you take a large amount of water and you boil it down to a smaller amount of water and then strain out the medicine and then drink the liquid. That's a decoction. People will also use tinctures. The benefit of the tincture is that the alcohol in the tincture will make the medicine last indefinitely. Even though turkey tail will prevent spoilage, it's not gonna prevent it indefinitely. Eventually, your soup or tea will go bad, but a tincture will not. You can keep it at room temperature, stable for as long as you like. Chewing the dried mushrooms is very common, and also for people that just don't wanna deal with making medicine, they just take some powder, put it in some more water, put it in a smoothie, and yeah, you can take it on an empty stomach, take it on a full stomach, it doesn't matter, it's food. It's very versatile in the way that it's consumed. If you wanted to do the powder, I would recommend getting the powder, because I've tried to grind up the mushroom bodies in my food processor or coffee grinder, and it's just really tough. So they have special machines that can get it to that really fine powder. So for most mushrooms, it's the water-soluble components that are sought. That's those long-chain polysaccharides. Sugars are water-soluble, and those are the components that affect the immune system. So if you're going to do an alcohol extraction, it's going to work better in a hydrated cell. I'm sure everybody's familiar with the idea of osmosis. You have a semi-permeable membrane in the center right there. On the left side, that's our turkey tail cell. On the right side, the dark blue, that's the alcohol solution. So for some reason, nature just wants to balance out water on both sides of that membrane. So if you have water on the inside of the membrane, it's going to, in the presence of alcohol on the outside of the membrane, it's going to vomit up its materials. It's going to suck all the water out. And sucking the water out, the long-chain polysaccharides will come with it. I think you felt that if you get alcohol on your hands, it's very dehydrating. You can't dehydrate something unless it's pre-hydrated. So if you have a dried mushroom material, soak it first and then extract the alcohol with alcohol. So I'm going to pass around another mushroom. This is reishi. It tastes quite different. And in tasting this, you might understand why people would want to make a tincture. Is everyone familiar with reishi? You guys have all heard of it? It's another really awesome anti-cancer, vitality-increasing mushroom. But it's very bitter. It doesn't taste good. So people like tinctures because the uptake is faster than taking a capsule. You don't have to, your body doesn't have to expend the energy to break down a capsule and then uptake the nutrients. So if you have weak digestion, a tincture might be really great because you're going to get the medicine a lot faster and it's going to be a lot less work for your body. Also, some mushrooms taste bad. And when you take a tincture, you can just shoot it in the back of your throat. You don't have to taste it. It's over. It's done with. And also, not all mushroom constituents are water soluble. In the case of turkey tail, the stuff that we want out of it is water soluble. But in the case of reishi, there are compounds called triterpenoids, and these are not water soluble. If you were to boil it in water, you might get out some of them, but you're not going to get out the full amount that the mushroom is making. So triterpenoids are only alcohol soluble, and they are beneficial because they'll control inflammation. They manage cholesterol. They have adaptogenic responses. An adaptogen is a class of herbs that nourishes your regulatory organs, so that if you're too high up in one way, it'll nourish your regulatory organs so that your body can naturally bring things down. If your immune system's too low, or your energy's too low, it'll nourish your adrenals and your immune system so that your body can naturally bring things up. Triterpenoids also have histamine effects, so if you have allergies, it's a great thing to have mushrooms that have triterpenoids, and you'll find those in reishi especially.
Then how do they make that into a powder form? That seems like it would be awfully expensive.
The reishi?
Into a tincture, yeah. Or either a tincture or into a powder. It says it's only extracted by alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yep, we're gonna go through that.
oh,
Yeah, I'll have a slide on. Medicine making with
Another
tincture.
question?
Yeah.
So like adaptogenic responses, what does that mean exactly?
So an adaptogen is a class of herbs that nourishes your regulatory organs. So for example, your adrenal glands are responsible for the amount of energy that you have. If your adrenals are depleted, they're not getting enough nourishment because you've just been working too hard and haven't been resting enough. Your adrenals are not gonna function as well to give you the energy that you need and calm you when you need. So adaptogenic herbs will nourish that organ so that organ is able to do the work that it needs to stabilize you. So some drugs, like if you were to drink caffeine, caffeine's only gonna make you go up. If you were to drink lavender, lavender's only gonna bring you down. But if you take reishi, if you're too high, it'll bring you low. If you're too low, it'll bring you high, because it's nourishing the organs that take care of that. It's not having a very specific effect on your body. It's nourishing your body so that your body can do what it does best, which is regulate you and bring you to the center, to homeostasis. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Homeostasis seems like a better term for it. It brings it up to
Yeah.
whatever you're supposed to be at.
Yeah, it is a really good term for it. Yeah, they're often used in conjunction.
Yeah.
So how much do you have to take? You got 3 grams.
I think 3 grams is the standard dose for most mushrooms. I'd have to look up specifically for reishi. But I think across the board for maintenance of health, people will do 3 grams. And then if you have like a really serious condition, people will do 6 grams. Okay, so this is how you make an alcohol tincture with a mushroom fruiting body. So the fruiting body, we're gonna be calling it the mark for the purpose of medicine making. In medicine making, the mark is the medicinal material that's being processed. So you wanna increase the surface area of your mark. You can do that by grinding it up. It doesn't have to be a fine powder, but the more surface area you have, the better extraction you're gonna get. So you take your mark, you grind it up, and then you decoct it. That's where you have it in a large pot of water, and then you simmer it down as much as you can. And in this process, we're gonna want as little decoction to alcohol extraction as possible. So simmer it as much as you can, get the most amount of water that you can out without burning it. And then do that for at least 1 to 2 hours. You can do it longer if you want to get the water down lower. It's not gonna, you can't overboil it, just don't burn it. And then you'll strain the water out. The water is the decoction. You strain the decoction and you put that water part into the freezer. We're gonna leave it there for a couple of weeks. Then we take the mark, the mushroom component that we were simmering, and now it's been prehydrated. Remember, we can do an alcohol extraction a lot better after something's been moistened first. And you take that mark and you tincture it. And you can do the folk method of tincturing. That's where, say we have mushroom material or mark to right here. It's kind of like making rice, where you would pour alcohol over it until it's 1 knuckle's worth above the medicine. And there are like specific weight to alcohol ratios that will vary with different mushrooms, but the folk method is just fine. Okay, it's okay. So then once you pour the alcohol over it in a mason jar, you would seal the mason jar and shake it every single day. If you don't shake it every single day, you forget about it, you'll want to keep it tinctured for 4 weeks. If you're really good about shaking it every single day, it'll be done after 2 weeks. So once it's extracted into the alcohol, you can strain it and combine it with the decoction that you froze. But you're gonna wanna do it at a specific proportion because we need a certain amount of alcohol to preserve it. This is how we calculate how much alcohol tincture to decoction, the ratio of the two. This is gonna get crazy, but don't worry about it. Okay, so keep in mind that alcohol will preserve your medicine as long as there's 30% alcohol in the tincture. However, studies have shown that more than 25% alcohol will break down long-chain polysaccharides. So this is kind of frustrating, right? We might lose some of the medicine if we are preserving our medicine indefinitely. So if you wanted to get the most amount of medicine, you could use 25% alcohol in your solution and then keep it in the refrigerator. It'll last much, much, much longer than it would if you just made a tea or if you just left it out on the counter. Or you could say, I'm gonna sacrifice some of the long-chain polysaccharides, I don't wanna have to worry about it, I'm gonna use 30% alcohol. You're gonna have to make a choice somewhere in between there. Okay, so we are trying to figure out this number right here, which is the percent of the tincture compared to the percent of the decoction. So we take, we make a decision whether or not we want 30% alcohol or 25% alcohol in the final tincture. For this formula, we decided on 30% alcohol is what we desire. We're not gonna worry about some of the long-chain polysaccharides, we just want it to preserve as long as possible. And we divide it by the percentage of alcohol that we used to tincture. So if you're using vodka to tincture, most vodka is 80 proof. So the alcohol content of that vodka is 40%. It's 40% alcohol and it's 60% water. So you divide by the percentage of alcohol. Then you multiply that number times 100. This will give you 75%. So that means in our final medicine, we want 75% of it to be the tincture and then 25% of it to be the decoction. And so that's not very much decoction, which is why we wanted to simmer it down as much as possible. Otherwise, we're gonna have a lot of decoction left over. And so, do you need me to keep on this slide so you can write all that down?
I'd like to take a picture.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
So if we're using Everclear,
Uh-huh.
which is what I usually get tinctures from,
Mm-hmm.
we would just use 30%
Mm-hmm.
to the decoction.
So if you were using Everclear, I think the proof of that is usually 180. So you would take 30% divided by 90% because a 180 proof Everclear is 90% alcohol. So it'd be 30 divided by 90 times 100. And then that will give you the percent of the tincture compared to the percent of the decoction that you froze 2 to 4 weeks ago. Does that make sense? You guys like math?
Everclear times 100,
Uh-huh.
so we're looking at milliliters?
It's
Or
gonna
just whatever?
percentages.
Okay.
So like if you have, what did that number come to? If you have 30 divided by 90 times 100?
23, so maybe 2300.
30 over 90. Yeah, so like 33%. So this is our full medicine right here. We divide it into threes. This is 33% right here. This is gonna be our tincture, and this will be decoction. 66% decoction. Does that make sense? Okay. You guys ready for the next slide? Okay.
And you add in the mark?
At this point, we're done with the mark.
Okay.
We should have a tincture, we should have a decoction, and the tincture is the alcohol extract, the decoction is the water extract. Everything's extracted from the mark. You can put it in the compost, give it to your dog, whatever you want to do.
Don't give it to your dog.
You can give it to your dog. I give it to my dog. Maybe not the, yeah, maybe the little bit of alcohol is not so great for the dog. They like it. Okay, was that too complicated? I think it's too complicated. You can just eat it. You can just put the powder in warm water. You can just chew on the dried mushroom. Your body knows how to extract the way a decoction does. It knows how to extract the way alcohol does. You are full of enzymes. Your body will pull out everything that it needs. Unless you're having weak digestion, you don't need to deal with all of that. Just eat it. It tastes fine. Or, I mean, yeah, I guess I would do that with reishi. It just tastes terrible. I make tea for Jeff, and he doesn't really like it. But he drinks it because he's a good boy. Okay, so we're going to take a little break before we start on the cultivation part. I'm just going to take a second to mention some things with Green Path Herb School. There's an in-depth program coming up next year. This is a herbalist foundation or herbalist certificate program. It's 9 months long. I think it's 5 days a week. It's pretty freaking cool. The groups are always amazing people, lifelong friends come out of this program. There's going to be more classes coming up next year. Elaine also does natural birth control planning, understanding how your fertility works. She also does herbal consultations. And there is a less intense but very thorough root program. So this is a weekend program for learning more about herbs, but not necessarily getting the full certificate. So take about 15 minutes. We'll meet up here. Bathroom's back there. Help yourself to tea. Help yourself to looking at these books. These are the cultivation books and medicine books. These are the mushroom identification. Mycelium is, but you can see some of the mycelium here. And then also in the cross section, you can see where the mushroom's growing. And it looks like it hasn't fully colonized the wood here, so it looks like this is going to be producing mushrooms for several years. So it's pretty.
So once you cultivate them, it's still workable? I mean, it's still producing?
Yeah. Some mushrooms or some woods will break down faster than others, and the speed at which it breaks down will determine how long it will produce mushrooms for. So, yeah, it always depends. That's always the correct answer in science. It depends. Okay. Yep. There's always exceptions in nature. So the cultivation story of turkey tail begins with the cultivation story of shiitake. Shiitake has been cultivated in the East for thousands of years. In this picture you can see what they're doing. They have some newly cut logs, and they place the newly cut logs next to logs that already have shiitake on them. And then they pound the logs that have shiitake on them, and this spreads the spores onto the uncultivated logs, and that's how they traditionally would inoculate them. But inevitably, when they are cultivating shiitake, they would find some logs that would turn up with turkey tail instead, because turkey tail is an excellent competitor. It's going to prevail over shiitake whenever it gets to the log first. And sometimes if it gets to the log second, it'll coexist, it'll compete, and so it just shows up a lot. And a lot of people think that it's very serendipitous that what we see as a weed or competitor is actually an ally to human beings. So turkey tail is so adaptable. It grows on most hardwood species. Fungi perfecti, Paul Stamen's company, says that it's been grown commercially on oak, alder, poplar, aspen, elm, ironwood. I've never heard of ironwood. Apple, cherry. Actually, there's not a whole lot of mushrooms that will grow on fruit trees Turkey tail is one of the few that will grow on apple and cherry wood. Also in eucalyptus, that's crazy. And Douglas fir. There's not a whole lot of mushrooms that will grow on conifers. Mushrooms that do grow on conifers will usually specialize in the conifers because the resins are just so antimicrobial that for a species to be able to grow on a conifer, it's just focused its enzymes on breaking down those resins. But turkey tail is able to not only grow on this wide variety of hardwoods, but also Douglas fir. I actually took a ponderosa log and inoculated it. It didn't do extremely well, but it did grow on the ponderosa and it did fruit, but not as much at all as it is here on this is Chinese elm, and this is an excellent local species to use because this grows into our pipes. It's a weed species. It's really, really plentiful. It grows really quickly, but then it breaks down. It's usually the logs that wind up on people's cars on windy days. So it's just kind of a nuisance, but it's awesome for turkey tail cultivation. They don't mention birch, but these dowels that we're using for inoculation are birch dowels, so I would assume that it could grow on birch as well. I don't know how plentiful the fruiting would be, but it will at least grow mycelium, if not fruit. So I'm going to use a lot of new words that I'm not so good at replacing them with common tongue, so I'm going to teach you my vocabulary. So the first word we need to learn is mycelium. Is everyone familiar with mycelium? Mycelium is the part of the mushroom that doesn't look like a mushroom. It's this cottony network of fibers. Like I was talking about, like right here, we can see the mycelium growing underneath the bark, and it's just like this white fuzzy stuff. It is the part of the mushroom that is responsible for nutrient extraction. So the mycelium will vomit up enzymes into the material around it. The enzymes will break down the material outside, digestion will happen outside of the mushroom. And then once it's broken down, the mycelium will absorb the broken down pieces. It's analogous to plant roots because it absorbs nutrients, but it's not the same as plant roots because plants don't digest. Plants will create things, but they don't digest things.
Wait a minute, can you expound that? I kind of got it, but I'm not sure.
So it's an analogy between plants and fungus, where the plant roots will absorb nutrients, the mycelium will also absorb nutrients. That's the ways that they're similar.
Okay, then how are they dissimilar?
They're dissimilar because mushrooms are able to digest things and break things down, which makes them more similar to us. We extract nutrients by eating things that are alive and then breaking them down in our stomachs. Plants will not digest things, but they'll absorb
The nutrients
in the soil, and then they'll create matter which is broken down by secondary organisms.
Okay.
So interestingly, the highest concentration of medicinal compounds is found in the mycelium. A lot of people think that you shouldn't use the mycelium because that's not what traditionally has been used. People traditionally use the fruiting bodies. But the reason that the fruiting bodies were traditionally used is because that's what's visible, that's what we can see. People aren't gonna go into wood and like scrape out the, like it just wasn't practical in the past. But nowadays we are able to grow mycelium in liquid batch cultures and grow it on grain. And we've studied the mycelium and we have found that the medicinal components are much higher in the mycelium. And this makes sense because the fruiting body is the end of the life cycle. It's the part that releases spores before the organism dies. But the mycelium is the most actively living. It's full of vitality. It's the most vital part of the organism. So we would expect that it's going to have the highest concentration of compounds that are beneficial to us as well. So the word substrate means the food source that the mushroom grows on. The substrate can vary. Right here, we have birch dowels as a substrate. Today, we're gonna inoculate this alder log. This alder log is the substrate. When people grow on grain, the grain is the substrate. And then the word inoculate means to introduce an organism to a substrate. So we are introducing turkey tail dowel spawn to our alder log substrate. Does that make sense? Any questions? Okay.
Do they actually do mycelium then commercial? Do they grow that?
Yeah, you can get mycelium from, they'll call it spawn most of the time, but you can get grain spawn, you can get dowel spawn, fungi perfecti, their website is fungi.com. And yeah, you can purchase.
So, but I guess what I'm trying to allude to though is mycelium more potent than the actual end product, which is the turkey tail that you take off?
Yep, that's what studies have shown.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yep. The word saprophyte means an organism that eats dead material. So all of the polypore species that are medicinal, all of those shelf fungi, they grow on dead wood. So they're referred to as saprophytes. It's an ecological classification. The fruit body is what we would recognize as a mushroom. It's the part that is responsible for spore production. And like we said before, after a mycelium consumes a substrate, it will produce a fruit body, and the fruit body will spread spores to a new substrate. Any questions?
He knows
Sure. Okay.
Sorry, I have a
Yeah.
question. I think you just said that the mycelium has more medicinal properties than the fruit body, so then why are people using still the fruit body of the turkey tail so much?
I think it's just tradition.
It's just tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And is it harder to get that mycelium and like separate it from the substrate?
It depends on what you grow it on. Like you wouldn't want to grind up wood and
Right,
make
you
that.
want to have a mix of like the two,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, but like if you were to grow mycelium on grain and then dry that out, you could consume that, and that would be very potent medicine.
Cool.
But I'm just thinking also that the mycelium is much thinner and not as big as, say, the turkey tail. So the mycelium that's growing the turkey tail is not only hard to get to, it's also a thinner product, so to speak. So
Yeah,
it'd be
there's
more intensive to make it.
it depends on how much substrate you have. So if you have a large amount of substrate, you're going to have a large amount of mycelium. And once it's fully colonized, it will be really dense. When it consumes all of its material, it turns all of that substrate into itself.
Oh.
Yeah, yeah. So oftentimes it appears that the fruiting body is larger, but more often than not, there is much more mycelium than fruiting body. A lot of the energy of the mushroom fruiting body goes into the structure and organization of the fruiting body, and not into the enzymes and compounds that the mushroom is using for digesting the substrate. So that energetic budget will take away from the medicine and go towards structural costs. That makes sense. Okay. Oh, we got so many slides before confusion. Okay, so the spore is the part of the fungus that contains the genetic information that will be transported to the next life cycle. It's kind of analogous to a sperm and an egg, but it's much more complicated in fungi. I've heard that there are 13 different sexes in fungus. I'm not going to pretend to understand how that works, but the spore will germinate. So this is the spore, and it germinates to produce mycelium. So that big mass at the end there is the mycelium. When it sends out just this one fiber, that one fiber is called a hyphae. That's the individual filament that makes up the mycelium. So, like the mycelium is the root structure, the hyphae is just like a little root hair. Questions? Okay, so a rhizomorph is also called a mycelial cord. And a rhizomorph is a aggregation of hyphae, of those individual filaments that are arranged in thick cores that are always running parallel to each other. So you can see here that instead of being a big fluffy mass, it's like a very tough aggregation of hyphae. And that is called a rhizomorph. Rhizo meaning root, morph meaning it looks like a root. So the wood requirements for log cultivation, you want a log that's less than 3 feet long. You can see in this log right here that we had it oriented in the ground like this, and it was very tall. We had it was like 4 or 5 feet long, but we didn't get any fruiting past like a foot or so because it's so dry here. If it was grown in a more wet environment, we might get fruiting all the way up 3 feet high, but because it's Montana, it was about a foot high. So if you're gonna grow it in this orientation, you want it to be a little shorter. If you were gonna grow it in this orientation, you could probably do it pretty long, but it's gonna be unwieldy.
It's gonna be what?
Unwieldy, just hard to manage. Just hard, like this was a much bigger log, but we chopped it today just because I didn't want to carry huge logs up the stairs. You want a log that's 4 to 10 inches in diameter. If it's too thick around, that might be a problem if you're using less competitive species. It probably wouldn't be an issue with turkey tail, but like if you were growing Hericium or reishi, they're really finicky and they don't compete very well. And if you have too big a log around, you're gonna get weeds in there, or like bacteria and competitive fungi that are gonna colonize before your medicinal mushroom can colonize. If it's any smaller than 4 inches in diameter, it's not gonna retain moisture as well. So you want that sweet spot, 4 to 10 inches. You want a log that's been cut at least 2 months ago. If it's less than 2 months old, there's still resins in the tree that will prevent the fungus from growing. If you're growing turkey tail, it's a great competitor, so it doesn't matter if it's a pretty old log. It doesn't matter if it's been colonized by other things. I've totally had fruitings on logs that had blue stain fungus in them. The turkey tail didn't care. But if you're using a less competitive species, a more finicky species, you do want to be like between 2 to 3 months old of a log, because if it's older than that, it's going to get colonized by other things and your fungus isn't going to establish. You do want to make sure that the log has its bark intact. If the bark is peeling off, it's not going to retain moisture as well. Any questions?
Yeah, I remember reading an arborist guy that was talking about, fungi, that somebody cut a tree down and they were having problems with the tree next to it that was still alive, and the other one was cut down and had a fungus on it. So my question then is, having something like this around a good live tree, does that bother it?
If there was a fungus growing on the live tree?
It was starting to, or it was maybe stressing the tree out. So this arborist said, get rid of that tree that's half dead or dead that had the fungus on it. So I'm just wondering if you found that out.
If it was a pathogenic fungus, it sounds like maybe the tree that was dying had a pathogenic fungus. And a pathogenic fungus, it's not going to live on dead wood, it's going to attack a living tree.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so we're talking about saprophytes, which eat dead materials.
Oh,
A
okay.
parasite's going to want a living material.
Okay.
So yeah, you would want to get that out of,
Okay.
yeah, just for epidemiological purposes. You just don't want to have sick trees around spreading disease. Okay, so we're using the dowel method. These are 5/16 inch dowel, furniture dowels. They're untreated. I was able to find more birch dowels online that were untreated, and I'm growing more mycelium on these. It's not growing fast enough, so I had to order some from Fungi Perfecti for today. But you just want to make sure they're untreated. You want the ones that have the these spiral grooves. There's some that have like parallel grooves, and those aren't as good because when you insert them into the log, it's going to scrape all the mycelium off. But these spiral grooves will act as like a little safe haven for the mycelium, so it's going to bounce back a lot better. It helps it recover from the shock of inoculation. So we have our log here. We're gonna drill holes that are 4 to 6 inches apart. So you can see Jeff didn't listen to me. He did them 2 inches apart, but that's okay. And they're like in a checkerboard pattern. If we had them like all in around a circle like this, we're not gonna get as even coverage as if it's in a checkerboard pattern. So they can be like expanding like and meeting up with each other a lot sooner. The mycelium will merge, the hyphae will encounter another colony, and they'll, it's called anastasize, and their hyphae will grow together. So you want to drill the holes 1.5 times deeper than the length of the dowel. So the dowels are going to be about this long. I put a little piece of tape here. This is how deep we're going to drill to. I'm not really comfortable using a drill. Does anyone?
1.5 inches deeper than the floor?
1.5, yeah, I put tape on here to how deep we want to drill towards. And if somebody wants to volunteer to be my drill person, I'm so happy. But we're gonna have a break before we start that. Okay, and so you can see he's hammering. He put the dowels. He drilled the holes. He put the dowels along the holes, and then he's hammering them in. Super easy. Okay, so they don't talk about this in the instructions from Fungi Perfecti, but I always soak the logs because when mycelium comes in contact with dry wood, it kind of like, it dies back because of osmosis. The dry wood is going to pull moisture out of the mycelium. So last night, I took this log and I put it in a bucket, oriented the way that the tree grew, because even though this tree is dead, it still has what's called the xylem. And the xylem is what wicks water up along the tree. So I submerged this in water like up to here, and it pulled water up. You can tell that this is the way the tree grew because this branch would come up this way. Yeah, so this log is pre-soaked. And in the past, I've inserted the dowels, waxed everything up, and then soaked it, but I wanted to try it a different way today to see if it made any difference.
So you soaked it for what, 24 hours you say?
About 12 hours.
12 hours and then?
You know, I left it out in the rain too, so it's just super wet.
Just whatever.
Yeah, you can see like this is like, I mean, it doesn't feel wet, but it's like darker, so.
Yeah, you got the whole log wet.
Yeah. Yeah, it feels wet up here. Not like soaking wet, but you can tell there's moisture in there.
It's the same thing with when you like, if you get really limpy kale, you cut the end off and
Yep.
put it in the water.
The xylem just does what it does. It doesn't have to be like actively alive. It just
Right.
is it's the way that it does. And it always goes in one direction.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then after we've inserted the dowels, we're going to paint beeswax over the holes. You can see where I've done that on this log. I used like an old candle. It wasn't even like good quality wax, but it worked just fine. And then I painted it on both sides, right here. This was inserted into the ground like this. So I did not put wax. I did not put wax on the bottom surface because I wanted it to wick water up from the soil. But the logs that are, if you decide to have a log laying down this way, you would want to wax both ends. And that'll just keep insects and other competitive fungus out. Yeah, they recommend cheese wax or beeswax, but yeah, that was paraffin wax, which is like crappy wax, and it was fine. The growth requirements for turkey tail are a pretty high relative humidity, 90 to 100%, which is pretty freaking moist. I think here in Montana it's been like about 40–45% relative humidity in my house. So you would want to put it like somewhere much moister. If you're growing out the spawn, it's okay to be room temperature, but when you're ready for it to start fruiting, it needs to be cooler, and the cooler temperatures will stimulate the fruiting. If you want to keep it outside, we would have started earlier. So this log, I'm not going to put it directly outside. It's not acclimated to the cold yet. So I'll probably put it like in my basement or my shop, somewhere that's kind of cold, and then after a couple weeks, or about 4 weeks, it'll be ready to put outside. You can tell that it is colonized when you start seeing like this discoloration here. It actually doesn't look like it grew very deep on here. I think that this is going to take several years to fully colonize, but on that log you can see it discolored, like that gray area. Yeah, a fungus isn't going to grow on something without making itself known. Like you can see fungus when it's there. That's a good indication that it was successful. All of the logs that I've done so far have been successful. It took a long time. We almost gave up. Most of our logs were done 2 years ago, and I just didn't see anything until the summer when it started raining a lot, and then everything just fruited all at once, and I was real happy. Yeah, it was pretty cool that like I'd done some logs that were just sitting on the surface. I didn't even submerge them in the soil. Even those were able to fruit, but fruited way, way, way less than the ones that were in a more moist place getting direct spray from our irrigation. So the ones that were in really shady places that were more like a forest setting did a lot better. This one was growing underneath our elderberry. So the elderberry is kind of growing over it and creating like shady dappled light, and then we had like irrigation like directly on it. That was really helpful. You can put it in your garden too, underneath like plants like potato and squash or lilac. Those have those big kind of canopies that will create like a moist microclimate for it. So yeah, shade and direct watering are the
So
most
then you
important
put
aspects.
maybe a foot in the ground, or
Yep,
6 inches, or?
enough to stabilize it.
Okay.
Yeah.
But
So
still 3 feet long.
yeah, I would like. I mean, those ones are grown pretty high. Keep in mind, Paul Stamens wrote this book in the Pacific Northwest.
And that's 40, 60 inches of rain.
Yeah, so like he probably could get fruitings that high there, but that I have not seen that here. The ones that I have growing I don't get fruitings any higher than this. So if I was going to submerge this in the ground, I would want it like up to here so that like this isn't wasted up here, you know? But turkey tail can grow, it can grow in this orientation or in this orientation. So I would think that you would get the most fruiting if you had it laying flat and then maybe like kind of mulched up around it. They buried it a little bit just so that it's like in contact with the soil and as wet as possible. Okay, so you can get multiple flushes. After your first fruiting, you can harvest your mushrooms, and if you wait a couple weeks, people will soak the log, fully submerge it in water. If it's raining, you'll see another fruiting like after like a really big deluge. I have not seen a second fruiting of the turkey tail yet, but I also haven't harvested everything, so I don't know. I'll have to get back to you guys next year to tell you how that goes. we're focusing on turkey tail, but I thought it was kind of interesting to note the ways that reishi is grown. Reishi does grow on dead wood, but it seems that it also needs to extract some nutrients from the soil, because the way that they're cultivating it is they have these logs that are completely buried. That guy has, he's mulched it with some gravel, but yeah, you'll always see reishi growing out of the soil, but there's wood underneath the soil. This guy over here, he's growing his reishi. He's got a mixture of wood and soil in those bags, and those bags are keeping the humidity in. This woman here on the left is growing it in the Pacific Northwest, so she's just got like a little bit of dirt at the bottom of the bucket. Like she's not even like sealing in the moisture at all. She doesn't need to because of the climate she's in. But yeah, she's growing commercially as well. And I have no idea how this is done, but this is so cool. They're doing reishi bonsai. I don't even know. It's amazing. It's amazing. Yeah, I just wanted you guys to see that. Looks creepy though, huh? Like, doesn't that look like some horrible monster on the right? Yeah, totally.
Well, what are the long parts? That's it too.
They're, it's like
Maybe
the
tentacles?
yeah, it's like their fruiting body's been. I
They
don't
like
know.
guided it.
They've guided it somehow. I have no idea.
Wow.
I know that fruiting bodies are influenced by CO2, so maybe they're like creating molds or something like that. Like, are you guys familiar with enoki? It's this mushroom that's in a lot of like, they'll put it in pho and like Asian soups, but they starve it of light and oxygen so that it grows in these really long filaments. But if you see it in the wild, it's like it'll look darker and have like whiter caps. But they'll, when they grow it commercially, they'll put like a cone around it, starving it of the light and oxygen, and it makes it grow just like more delicately. And it's delicious. I love gnocchi. I wish someone grew a gnocchi around here. So, shiitake methods, we talked earlier about how they would have the colonized logs next to the uncolonized logs. They'd bang on the colonized ones that would spread the spores onto the uncolonized logs. And then they'll stack them in this pattern right here. And this is allowing air to go through, but it's also keeping the humidity high. And then they drape a cloth over it. And I'm pretty sure this is like still how it's done today. People will do stump culture. The benefit of doing stump culture is that there's an extensive root system underneath the ground. It's not just a log. Like, there's so much wood that you can't even see. So you get fruitings for like years and years and years afterwards. And instead of doing like all the way around the log, for some reason, they just do in a circle around the edge of the stump. And then they seal it with wax. And yeah, it takes a I don't know about that. I feel like I would want to put more inoculant in, but I guess,
So they don't do it on the side?
yeah, for some reason that's like,
But that's
Some
where it's
in the
gonna grow
backyard,
from,
but it's
isn't it?
big.
it'll grow, depending on the mushroom. Turkey tail will grow on the top and the sides.
But I thought if you've got the paraffin or the beeswax on top, it's not gonna go through that, is it?
It doesn't seem to be doing that on this, no. Yeah, it's gonna be stimulated to fruit by oxygen. So if there's wax on the top, it would probably want to fruit out the sides instead.
Right.
So, yeah, I don't know. I haven't done a stump culture. I don't have any stumps yet. Okay. So you can order Mycelium from Fungi Perfecti. You can also become really familiar with the fungus that grows in our area and collect wild cultures. This is a quote from Paul Stamets. He says, he's so poetic. I love it. Fans of Mycelium race everywhere. You can easily find Mycelium beneath downed log, and among stacks of aging firewood, or in piles of leaves or wood chips. Practically any fallen tree or piece of wood that has been lying on the ground for a few months will host Mycelium on its underside. So before you start collecting wild cultures, maybe just start looking around when it's moist and see if you can find places where mycelium is growing. I wouldn't recommend colonizing mycelium if you don't know what it is, but becoming familiar with mycelium, it's probably the first step into finding wild cultures. Wild spawn is not going to be as pure as cultured spawn that you're buying from the laboratory, but the advantage of it is that it's already had contact with microbes, so it's going to better acclimate to wild climates. If you want to grow something in the wild, getting something that's already from the wild is going to be much more vigorous. If you have something that's from a laboratory, it might not compete as well in the wild. It's probably going to do better in a laboratory because that's what it's used to. It's not acclimated to the wild. If you do get a wild culture, one mistake that I've made time and time again is bringing home mycelium and leaving it out at room temperature for too long. And the problem with that is that there is bacteria in contact with it, and bacteria grows better at warmer temperatures. Fungus grows better at cooler temperatures. So if you want to give your fungus an advantage, if you take it home, first of all, inoculate it right away, as soon as you can. But if you can't, put it in the fridge. It's just going to do a lot better. The bacteria is going to grow slower and give the fungus a better chance. It's also going to do better if it's in a well-ventilated environment. It needs to be moist, but not in standing water. When you find wild cultures, you want to find mycelium that has these rhizomorphs. The rhizomorphs are going to leap off, they're going to be more vigorous. And the way you can tell that it's vigorous is if you pick up a piece of wood and there's little wood chips hanging from the rhizomorph is strong enough to hold those chips suspended in the air. That's a good sign that it's going to leap off onto your new substrate a lot more vigorously. You can find, oh, here's some more beautiful quotes from Paul Stamets. Mushroom sense, or even the absence of mushrooms, even in the absence of mushrooms, informs us that mycelium is alive and thriving. So like when you're out in the forest, you know that sweet smell that just like makes you feel like safe? That's mycelium growing in the soil of the forest. In a sense, mycelium breathes, emitting a fragrance that is a valuable feature to the experienced mushroom gatherer. Scents are often species specific and recognizable. So after a while, you'll start to recognize, even if you don't see the fruiting bodies, you might be able to recognize the mushroom by the way that it smells. So there's a couple of different strategies for bringing mycelium into a culture. Right here, this shows taking a wood fragment and placing it onto wet cardboard. When people use wet cardboard, they'll take the, they'll like soak it and then peel off the top and bottom layer and just use the corrugated wavy material on the inside. That's going to be less, it's not going to have as much contact with contaminants. So like if you were to just use the cardboard with the surfaces still attached, you're probably going to have more competitors than if you peel both of those sides off and just use the wavy stuff in the middle. And so yeah, they soaked it and then they just put the wood onto the cardboard and then did another layer of the corrugated on top of that and sandwiched it. Another thing people will do is use stem butts, and the stem butt is this part right here at the bottom of the mushroom. A lot of people ask, why don't you just use the spores? And the problem with spores is that the spores are the sperm and eggs. You never know what you're going to get when you bring a sperm and an egg together. It might be a vigorous mushroom, it might not. It might be a combination that isn't going to be as productive as you'd like it to be. But if you use this material down here, this is going to be a clone of what you found. It's going to be a more predictable genetic blah, blah, blah. So it's also the most vigorously growing part of the mushroom, the stem butt. So like right here, I took a bit of the wood off of here and I didn't take it from a stem butt portion, and it's growing super slow. If I had taken part of the stem butt and put that in there, I would expect it to have been colonized by now. It's doing okay, but it's just not as vigorous as the stem butt would have been.
What kind of mushroom is it?
That's a morel.
Morel.
So the species that are known to grow from stem butts are shaggy parasol, many morel species, Namiko, which is in Japanese cuisine, lots of oyster species, oysters super prolific, lots of psilocybin species, King stropharia, and of course turkey tail. Paul Stamen says, my rule of thumb is this: if a mushroom is a saprophyte with rhizomorphs, its stem butt will likely regrow when planted. So you guys just remember rhizomorph and saprophyte. So if it's growing on dead wood, and if it has those tenacious root-like hyphae, then it's going to regrow on the material. So this is a diagram from his book where he shows taking a stem butt, introducing it to dowel spawn, introducing it to the corrugated cardboard, introducing it to burlap, and just proliferating it and creating these landscapes of mushrooms.
You ever put it in a cardboard?
I have not had a lot of success with it, to be honest with you. I've had a lot more success doing the dowel spawn. And I wonder if that's just my laziness. Like, I'm not always so great about checking on it. And I'm not always so great about keeping it moist. I've had it just dry out. Like, I'll check on it and the cardboard isn't wet anymore. Or like I'll bring something home and I won't introduce it to the cardboard right away. It's not as forgiving as this container that like keeps the humidity high. So I've had a lot more success with that. But plenty of people have had success with it. Here's a picture of Paul Stamen's wife, looking very relaxed, with her tray of psilocybin. And so what she did was she took the mushrooms, she clipped off the stem butts, laid it out on the corrugated cardboard, and then discarded the cap, or ate it, whatever she's into. So you keep the mycelium attached to the stem butt, you introduce that to the corrugated cardboard, and then you sandwich it between 2 layers of the corrugated cardboard. The corrugated cardboard is not the best substrate. It's more of like a transfer material. You're not going to get good fruitings from it, but if you can grow mycelium out onto it and introduce it to wood chips, the wood chips will be a better substrate. You can also take your stem butts and introduce them directly into dowels, like this. You don't necessarily need to sterilize the dowels. I have sterilized them before, but I felt like it leached a lot of the nutrients out of the wood. Like I would boil them for 10 minutes and then strain the water out, and then the water would just, it would just be really like, it just looked really yummy. And I just feel like the mushrooms could have used that. So with this dowel spawn, I just soaked it for a couple days until the dowels looked darker, because they'd soaked up the water, and then just plopped my myceliated bark in there. Once you have a little bit of dowel spawn, you can make a lot of dowel spawn. In the laboratory, we would talk about the mass effect, where if you have 1 part spawn to 4 parts substrate, you don't necessarily have to worry about sterility. If you mix it up, the 1-to-4 ratio will guarantee that your species is going to colonize before a weed species can get in. And you do want to mix it up every once in a while, because not too often, it's kind of like tilling the soil. If you till too often, it reduces fertility, but if you till when it's 25 to 50% colonized, it will stimulate colonization. So they suggest incubating the cultures outdoors. They also live in the Pacific Northwest. They just put it in a cardboard box. They put it next to the cement foundation of a house. The reason you would want to have a cement foundation is because rock, cement, That sort of material will buffer heat fluctuations. And if it's next to the foundation, the fungus is gonna be more stable heat-wise. They allow the box to be naturally soaked by rainfall. If you put it out 4 weeks before the freeze, it'll naturally acclimate to the freeze and thaw and recover. I would not suggest doing this when it's very dry out. I think that like if you were gonna do this, like time it for our wet season, or put it somewhere that's irrigated, like in the early spring. So I was saying earlier, once the mycelium covers 25 to 50% of the cardboard, it can be transferred. If it's over incubated, the mycelium will die back. For this reason, it's best to move the mycelium at the crest of growth, what I call surfing the mycelial wave. He's so cute. So you can use your master outdoor patch to make several contact mycelial prints. So once you have a patch outdoors, you can take your corrugated cardboard and lay it on the myceliated patch, let it grow 25 to 50%, and then transfer that to another wood pile. It's like a footprint for anything that you lay it on. So right here what she's doing is she's got a big patch of wood chips, and she has quite a bit of that corrugated cardboard. She puts the corrugated cardboard in contact with the soil, and that prevents soil microorganisms from growing up into the wood chips. She puts the wood chips on top of the corrugated cardboard that has the mycelium growing on it, and then she does another layer of the corrugated cardboard covered in mycelium on top, so it's sandwiched in between the two. And this makes sure that the fungus is going to be growing into the wood chips and that nothing else can get into the wood chips because it's protected by those 2 layers of the corrugated myceliated cardboard. And then she puts leaves on top to keep the moisture in and mulch it. And this is their psilocybin patch. It's growing outdoors. It's not illegal to have it in your garden. You can't have it indoors, but yeah, if it's growing outside, it's, you know, it's totally good.
Good idea.
I would include it.
Yeah, totally. It's good to have a little guide. Okay, so the sources I used for this talk are right here. I used The Fungal Pharmacy by Robert Dale Rogers. This is a little instruction book for growing with log culture. This is something that I got from Host Defense. It talks about the medicinal studies for medicinal mushrooms. This is Paul Stamen's book, Growing Medicinal Mushrooms, the 3rd edition. Feel free to look through those. I would like to do a shorter break, just a 5-minute break, because I need to check on the beeswax. So I guess go ahead and get some tea. We'll meet back here 3:15, okay? Grilling, you guys ready for grilling? Okay.
I love art. Okay, where do you want it coming over?
Okay, so we're doing, we're having them spaced apart like this, and then we're gonna stagger them, see how it's like a zigzag pattern?
Okay,
So,
just right here?
yeah, perfect. I'm gonna go check on the, you can just go to that where that tape is, and then if you want, yep. Cool, I'm gonna check on the wax. I'll be right back.
If you just keep it going while you pull out, it'll work for you.
Okay. Enough, you want a little more?
Sure.
Okay, and what's more over here?
Yeah, staggered. probably about 4 inches to this side, so we'll skip this side right here and then just do this surface. So we can do them a little bit further apart on this side, like one right here, next one right here.
Okay.
So we probably only need 4 in a row. Thank you so much. And then maybe we can do like another like row right here. I'll hold that up for you.
You want them in between?
Yeah, exactly. I think it'll also be interesting to if that's not a good spot, we can just skip it.
Well, just put that
I think it'll be really interesting because we did it differently on this side than on this side. And I think that when we look at the cross section, it'll be interesting to see like how it'll grow on this side versus this side. So, get out all the, yep, awesome, thank you so much. So, the next thing we do is we're gonna place our plugs in the holes. There are actually little tiny turkey tail fruiting bodies growing off of these, like super, super tiny.
Can I look at one?
Yeah, totally. Pass that around.
Those are the ones you ordered from fungi.com?
Yep, fungi.com is Paul Stamens.
Oh, they are tiny.
Yeah. So the size of the fruiting potty will totally depend on the size of the substrate.
yeah.
Oh, that one already has one. Okay, and then you hammer it in.
I'll try to sell it.
Okay. I used a drill bit that's a little bit bigger than, the dowels are 5/16, and the drill bit I used is 9/32, I think. I used 5/16 last time and it was just too tight, and this is perfect.
What size?
The drill bit is 19/32, I think.
19 or 32.
I think so. I'll double check. This is so much easier than the stuff I used to have to do in the lab. It's like a lot more energy intensive. I had to use a lot more sterility. And I just love that this is just super easy.
What type of substrate did you use in the lab?
I would use agar. Put a little bit of antibiotic in it because the species that's carried by the mountain pine beetle isn't the best competitor. It's like always either inside of these pockets in the beetle's face called mycangia, or inside the tree. It's never like out in the open. It doesn't actually produce any spores. So I did it. That was not that bad.
lost your-
I totally could have done that.
you lost
All right. So we're done with this.
your- And you're gonna lay that horizontally then, you're not gonna put that in the
I
ground.
think I want to keep this one horizontal. Yeah, the ones that I did submerged, just, I was unimpressed. Okay, so I'm gonna get my wax now. Back here. That is submerged in that pot which has boiling water in it. And I let it simmer. And then I have this paintbrush that Jeff says I could use. Because it's a cheap one. I tried to use one of his art brushes and he freaked out.
So it will grow out around the beeswax, is that it?
It's gonna,
Since it's not gonna grow through it?
it's gonna grow into the wood. The beeswax will probably prevent it from fruiting, so I wouldn't want to cover it completely. The fruit is stimulated by the presence of oxygen, so we're probably gonna see fruitings coming out in between where I painted.
Are you putting the beeswax into the holes
Yes, I
before
am.
putting the dowels?
Nope.
After?
Yeah, I put the dowels in and then I'm
Okay.
sealing the
You're
surface.
sealing it, okay.
Yeah, the dowel's in there and I don't want, it's delicious. Things are gonna try to eat it, so I'm sealing it so nothing can get into it.
So nothing else goes in.
Yep, exactly.
Now, if you're putting the log vertically,
Hmm.
would you still put the wax over the plugs?
I would, yeah.
I was just thinking you would just do the top part that it was exposed and then the other bottom part that goes into the wood.
If you were putting it in the ground like this, you
Yeah.
would not wanna seal the bottom part.
No,
Because
but
then you
the
want
top
water.
you would.
The top, definitely, yeah.
But you're still gonna seal all the plugs.
Yep, because,
Okay.
yeah, they'll desiccate too. You know, the wax is gonna keep moisture in,
Okay.
yeah.
When you put the dowels in, those little baby fruiting bodies
Uh-huh.
got pushed off.
Yep.
But that's okay, because the
It's
mycelium's in there.
Mhm,
Okay.
Totally.
So it'll survive the winters here if it's established?
Mm-hmm. Yep, this one has been out for the last 2 winters.
That works way better than the first time that we used just regular
The
candle
paraffin.
candle wax.
Yeah,
The beeswax is a lot more pliable and soft.
yeah, it smells really good.
That's really good.
Probably got more beeswax here than I needed though.
Okay.
And beeswax cheaper or more expensive?
I don't know. Well, the candle wax,
Paraffin's pretty cheap.
Yeah.
This stuff is 95 cents an ounce downstairs at Meadowsweet. But yeah, I guess it's not super cheap.
But it's a petroleum product, whereas the beeswax is
Right,
not.
right.
So
Yeah.
now if you're gonna lay that down, you're still doing both ends, or are you gonna seal both ends?
I am. I have to put this back on the heat though. Yeah, sealing both ends will just keep it from drying out faster.
Yeah, you can see stuff growing in there.
Mhm.
You can see stuff growing in there.
Yeah.
I guess that's about it, unless you want to see me seal the other end. You guys have any questions?
So we shouldn't expect our first crop in August.
I mean, if you kept it really wet and the weather was really beneficial and you had a really small log like this, yeah, maybe. I don't know. I think that mine just were not getting irrigated enough is why it took so long. But it's cool that it survived, even though it wasn't. And I think maybe my logs were bigger too. Yeah, this one might fruit in August. I don't know. I'll keep all your phone numbers and let you guys know.
Can you grow turkey tail on the cardboard method?
So the cardboard, the mycelium will grow, but the fruiting bodies might not.
Right.
So I have seen people do oyster. Oyster has like less stringent nutritional requirements, and I've seen people grow oyster on cardboard, but I think the turkey tail is gonna want more complex materials that are found in the wood.
Okay.
So I would just use the cardboard as like a transfer. It's like
Wood chips.
yeah, it's like a go-between rather than something to work off of.